Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's lecture. My name is Adam Thomas, Executive Director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to our lecture, which is part of our America's Founding and Future series and our special America 250 celebration with co-sponsorship from the Jack Miller Center. For those of you who are not familiar with the James Madison Program, we are a program dedicated to exploring enduring questions of American constitutional law and Western political thought. If you would like to learn more about everything that we do, please visit our website, jmp.princeton.edu, and follow us on X @Madison Program. On our website, you can sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to our Madison's Notes podcast, and learn more about all of our upcoming events. It is now my great pleasure to welcome Yuval Levin back to Princeton and to the James Madison Program. Yuval is the Beth and Ravenel Curry Chair in Public Policy and Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, and the founder and editor of the journal National Affairs. He is also a senior editor at the New Atlantis, contributing editor at National Review, and a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. Yuval's career admirably bridges the usual divides between academia, government, and public policy. He holds a doctorate from the University of Chicago and the Committee on Social Thought, served on the domestic policy staff under the President George W. Bush, and was for many years at the Ethics and Public Policy Center before moving to his current position at the American Enterprise Institute. He is a frequent and, more importantly, insightful commentator on American politics and culture, and the author of several important books of political theory and public policy, most recently of American Covenant, How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. Today's lecture is co-sponsored by the Jack Miller Center and is titled, How Should We Celebrate America's 250th? Please join me in welcoming Yuval Levin. Thanks, Yuval.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. It's always wonderful to be at Madison Program events. The welcome here is great, and I got to spend a little time with undergrads just now. That is really one of the few ways that still exists to make yourself hopeful about America, is to spend a little time with the young people that Robbie gathers here. It's especially an honor for me to be asked to speak as part of your celebration of what's come to be called the semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary or 250th birthday of the founding of the United States. I think that we should always be grateful for an opportunity to celebrate our country, and particularly to do that in a way that is rooted in the history of our founding, in the ideas advanced in the American Revolution, which is so crucial to us, and in the events of the Revolution and the founding era, which have stamped their mark on the American character now for a quarter millennium. Because we are marking both ideas and events, we could begin our celebrations this past April with the anniversary of Lexington and Concord. We can mark events along the way to the all-important anniversary of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, which rightly is at the heart of the semi-quin celebrations. And we can continue to mark crucial points all the way through Yorktown and beyond. I'm sure that here in Princeton, they'll find ways to mark the anniversary of the Battle of Princeton in January of 2027. I, for one, am looking forward to the 250th anniversary of the Constitution, 12 years from now, marking what I think was the concluding achievement of the founding era. Celebrating America in this peculiar way is both right and important. Our country deserves it. We need it. It'll do us good. But it's an occasion that should also be an opportunity for reflection and for deepening our understanding, our conception of just what it is that we're celebrating. That kind of reflection could sound like a strangely intellectual way to celebrate a happy occasion, but I think it's actually a distinctly American kind of patriotism. This country has always offered its people fodder for serious thought. And Americans have always looked on our country both as the home we love because it is ours, and as a kind of socio-political achievement that has to be measured against its ideals. We're moved to celebrate and honor America. We're also constantly moved to think about America. And that dual character actually has a lot to do with what it is that we're marking in this year of civic celebration. And so I took your invitation to speak today as an opportunity to think about a question that I think is worth our time as we approach the 250th. I want to raise a seemingly simple question that I hope might be a little bit deeper than it first appears. And the question is, really, what kind of occasion is this? Or maybe another way to ask it is, 250th what? I gestured at that question in opening just now by calling this coming year a birthday and an anniversary, which after all are different things. We gesture at it also when we call it the semi-quincentennial, as people try to do, if we can pronounce that word, or when we just say America at 250, or America's 250th, without really specifying more than that. I think it was a little bit like this back in 1976 too, which people just referred to as the bicentennial. These are ways of being a little vague about the nature of the occasion by describing it with adjectives devoid of nouns. When you celebrate a wedding anniversary, you don't just call it the 25th. When you send somebody birthday wishes, usually you wouldn't just say happy 40th, or if you did, they would know exactly what you mean. It would be perfectly clear. But as we prepare to mark this coming civic milestone, I think we actually are at a bit of a loss for words, and in a way that should cause us to think. And so it seemed to me that what I'd do with you tonight is consider how we might describe this occasion, and therefore also how we could approach this occasion. And by thinking about that, maybe also think a little bit more deeply about the nature of American patriotism and the challenges of calling the rising generation of Americans to the work of citizenship in our time. So let's start by taking up this question in the simplest sense. What kind of occasion is America's 250th? 250th what? One natural way to answer that question is that we're celebrating a birthday. And America is going to turn 250 years old next year. What that calls for is a kind of national birthday party. I think that is almost instinctively how a lot of our celebrations are going to take form. There are places that are certainly planning on birthday parties with cakes and candles, with singing. Some of the most grand of our national celebrations are going to approach the occasion almost as a kind of birthday. This is not a simple-minded way to think about this civic moment. On the contrary, it actually comes naturally because there is something deeply right about it. Our founding launched something new in the world. It was a beginning, and in that sense was a kind of birth. This is actually how Abraham Lincoln thought about the nation's founding, for example. In November of 1863, he opened the Gettysburg Address with words that have become so familiar, I think, to civically educated Americans that we don't often enough stop to think about the particular image that Lincoln is trying to convey. He said this, 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. In speaking of 87 years, 87 years before 1863, he's pointing us to the year we'll be celebrating, to 1776. And what happened in that year, he said, was that a new nation was conceived and brought forth. Sustaining it through the Civil War, he said at the very end of the speech, would make possible a new birth of freedom, analogous to that first birth at the founding. And in that sense, what happened 250 years ago was a kind of birth. But I think that the inadequacy of a simple birthday metaphor is actually implicit in Lincoln's own language. The new nation, he told the crowd at Gettysburg, was not just conceived and born, it was dedicated to a proposition. In pointing to the founding, he wanted to point to its achievement, to its distinct character and commitment, its ambitions, its aims, which he hoped could still exercise a profound pull on the minds of his own contemporaries. That is not generally how a birthday works. Birthday celebrations don't actually mark the importance of the birth in question, generally, but the path that's been traveled since then. They're about marking age and growth and duration. Now, that's certainly part of what we are doing in celebrating America's 250th. And describing the celebration as a birthday is surely partly right. The sheer duration of our country is, in fact, a real achievement. We Americans like to think of ourselves as a young country, energetic and dynamic always, but we are actually one of the oldest of the existing polities in the modern world. There are a number of older nations on the earth, but there are very few older regimes. The British, from whom we separated 250 years ago, may in fact be the only other nation in the world that can claim to have had the same regime without interruption for longer than we have. Every other country on the map has either declared its independence after us or seen its political life transformed by conquest or by revolution or a fundamental change of government at least once since the end of the 18th century. We are, by now, an exceptionally old nation, and marking our national birthday is a way of drawing attention to the durability of what began back then. Long life is a mark of health, and that is something to celebrate. But the birthday of an older person isn't really an occasion to look forward, as this ought to be, or to revitalize our aspirations. Even at its most appropriate, the analogy to birthday celebrations doesn't really capture what we mean to celebrate on the 4th of July. When we mark that day, we point to what took place then, to what was said and done and declared and achieved. In that sense, we're not really marking a birthday. What you and I did on the day we were born really wasn't very impressive. What our country did in the era of its founding was very impressive. And so, while there's nothing wrong with a birthday party for the country, it's not exactly the right way, or at least not completely the right way, to express our admiration and mark the occasion. America's 250th isn't just a birthday. So what else is it? When we don't resort to the language of birthday, we often fall back instead on the analogy of an anniversary for marking the founding. This year marks the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. That does address some of the inadequacy of the birthday analogy. An anniversary marks an important event rather than just marking the time since a beginning. In fact, strange as it may seem at first, an analogy to the most common kind of anniversary that we celebrate, a wedding anniversary, may be actually especially appropriate. What we're marking over the coming year, and especially next 4th of July, is the anniversary of a decision to start something together. In a sense, it is the anniversary of a union. That's not immediately obvious to us because we're much more used to thinking of America's independence as a result of a decision to separate than of a decision to unite. That is, after all, what most of the Declaration of Independence declares. And it says so in the very first sentence. Here's how it starts, another familiar line from our political tradition. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. A wonderful run-on sentence. But here again, those of us who love this document are so used to hearing these words that we don't really hear them. Notice who the two actors are in that first sentence. One people and another. There are two peculiar things going on in that description. First of all, the Declaration says that the American people and the English people were already two peoples. What's being declared here is not the birth of the American people as distinct from the English. Those had already been two for a while, apparently, and these two peoples were long united by political bands. What's new is that the Americans are now moving to dissolve them. But once you see that, you realize something even more extraordinary about this sentence. Before it even mentions the British, the Declaration refers to the American people as one people. The Americans are making a decision to dissolve political bands, and they're making that decision as one people. In fact, even before this reference to one people, before the Declaration really gets going, there's a header on the original document as it was published that describes it as the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. There's another phrase that we see so often that we don't really stop to think about it. The Declaration of Independence is only the second document that historians are aware of that uses this phrase, the United States of America. It's not a phrase that was in common use to describe what was happening in the Revolution until that time. The first was a letter written by Stephen Moylan, an aide to George Washington, a few months earlier in January of 1776, and then the Declaration. Almost as much as the separation from Britain, the Declaration of Independence announced the unification of the American colonies, at least in their common decision to separate. In this sense, to mark the anniversary of the beginning of our national life, or at least our national political life, is to mark the decision of the founders to unify so as to create a union that would make our own lives and our own flourishing possible. To celebrate that in terms of an anniversary and to hear in it an echo of the celebration of a wedding anniversary is not at all unreasonable. The founding was as much a marriage as a divorce, particularly in relation to us, the descendants of the founders. We are not children of divorce, but of a decision to unite in an effort to launch something new. That choice is what we celebrate, and why we mark the anniversary on the 4th of July in particular. An anniversary in this respect is a somewhat better analogy than a birthday for what we're celebrating. An anniversary does point back to a beginning, but it also marvels at the span of time over which what was begun at that point has persisted. And from the extent of that span of time, it concludes both that the Union was well begun and that it has been well maintained and strengthened, no doubt through a lot of effort and wisdom and affection and love. An anniversary also points forward more concretely than a birthday. Both mark milestones along a path that we hope will continue. But a wedding anniversary suggests that with continuing work and commitment and love and affection, the Union can continue to flourish and to grow in strength and depth. So America's 250th is not just a birthday, it's also, in part, an anniversary. But even that combination doesn't quite capture everything that this occasion needs to be for us. We can get at what is still missing by thinking about the possessive pronouns that we apply to a birthday and an anniversary. A birthday is your birthday or my birthday. Your parents' wedding anniversary celebrates something other people did. Yes, they're your people, they're my people, but they aren't you or me. Which of these applies to our country in its beginnings? Is it about us or is it about them? The nation's founding is our founding, and this is our nation. It's existed continuously since that founding era. But you and I did not found this country. We inherited it. Maybe you were born here. Maybe, like me, you came here from another place, and in time you embraced American citizenship. Either way, America was here. You didn't found it, and you didn't really choose what it would be. You're probably not descended from the founders in any biological sense, although maybe here at Princeton there are a few people who are. What is really your relation to them? And in what sense are you continuous with them? Who are the founders to us? And how can we celebrate what they founded as ours? Americans have actually always struggled with this question, as we struggle with it now. And we've tended implicitly to deal with it in both conceptual and practical ways, or maybe I would say in both philosophical and visceral ways. One way we've answered this question of our relation to the founders is by pointing to ideas or philosophical commitments that connect us all across generations. Here again, Lincoln offers the best model. In July of 1858, he gave a wonderful speech about the nature of American citizenship, and he took up the question of how Americans who did not themselves found the country are connected to the founding. Some Americans of his generation were descended from people who had fought in the Revolution, he said, as he was himself. But others came from elsewhere, or were descended from people who came after the founding and had no ties of blood to the founding. This is what he said about them, I quote, "If they look back through this history to trace their connection with those days by blood, they find they have none. They cannot carry themselves back into that glorious epoch and make themselves feel that they are part of us. But when they look through that old Declaration of Independence, they find that those old men say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And then they feel that moral sentiment taught in that day evidences their relation to those men, that it is the father of all moral principle in them, that they have a right to claim it as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of the men who wrote that declaration. And so they are. And so they are, Lincoln said. And so they are. They are blood of the blood and flesh of the founders. I have to tell you that I cannot hear those words without goosebumps, because they are about me and they're about you. They tell us that we are Americans, flesh of the founders in the way that matters, because we know that what they declared was true and is true and always will be true. That's an extraordinarily powerful connection to have with them, and it begins to tell us how to relate to them, how to celebrate what they did 250 years ago. It begins to get us beyond the analogy of a birthday or even an anniversary and toward a deeper analogy, in a sense, to family, to intergenerational connection. But it doesn't get us all the way there, because it is very abstract and cerebral. Lincoln was right that the ideas at the core of the American founding, at the philosophical heart of the Declaration of Independence, are essential to our connection to the founding generation of Americans and to each other. But those ideas are not everything. They're not all we're celebrating. A nation is not an abstraction, but a concrete reality. It's a living society with a character and a culture and a history, full of people who are our real-life fellow citizens, to whom we owe our loyalty. And yet our particular national character as Americans has always been uniquely oriented by certain principled commitments to the truth. Our national identity is therefore both philosophical and visceral. We share a common home in which we've lived a common life together over generations that has always been committed to a set of ideals, religious and philosophical, Republican and liberal, including a belief in natural rights rooted in natural equality and pointing to a politics of justice. Our national commitments add up to a people born and bred to seek freedom and virtue together. In this sense, we love America because it is ours and also because it points us toward the truth. And there is not a contradiction between the two. I can't help but look to Lincoln one more time on this point. When his hero, Henry Clay, died, Lincoln eulogized him by saying that Clay, quote, loved his country partly because it was his own country, but mostly because it was a free country. This is often true of our families, too. We love them because we belong to them. They are the very sources of our being, but we also love them because they've formed us toward flourishing. They've given us love and faith and culture and community and tradition as foundations for our thriving. They've brought us forward from prior generations and brought forward for us what is true and beautiful in life. I want to suggest to you that in this analogy, there is some real wisdom about how to celebrate America's 250th. It's not that politics is like family life, or the government is like a family. It's not even that the nation is like a family. Those analogies can mislead us very easily if we stretch them too far, because they ignore the essential generational character of family life. The president should not be thought of as a father, and politics isn't a family squabble. That's not where the analogy lies. But a nation has to be understood intergenerationally. That's where there is an analogy to understand. Our relation to our national tradition, our connection to what we celebrate when we celebrate America's 250th, really could be helped by a kind of analogy to family roots, precisely because it is a tradition that spans generations. And we can think about how we relate to a tradition we're part of by thinking about how we relate to the sources of our being, to our parents and our ancestors. Edmund Burke gestures toward this kind of approach to national attachments. He says in the Reflections on the Revolution in France, "We have given to our frame of polity the image of a relation in blood, binding up the constitution of our country with our dearest domestic ties, adopting our fundamental laws into the bosom of our family affections." Notice the crucial distinction that he draws in that line. The image of a relation in blood, not the reality of a relation in blood. Just like the lines I quoted from Lincoln earlier, the image, and with it a crucial part of the love of country, is achieved by treating our country as a source of what we have in common with those with whom we have the most in common. It's precisely a way of extending our sense of who we are as a people beyond blood ties to both common experiences and common commitments. This can help us to formulate the question that I'm raising with you tonight a little more clearly and in a way that might point toward an answer. When I say how should we celebrate America's 250th, part of what I'm asking is how should we understand our relation to a national tradition that we are part of? This is a kind of question that we constantly confront. It's not just a political question. It's a question we can ask in relation to a religious tradition that we're part of, or a cultural tradition that we're part of, and also a political one. How should we relate to our own tradition? What hold does it have over us? What attitude should we have toward it? It's not an easy question, especially for people living in a free society, because it's a question that forces us to confront the limits of our freedom. And it has everything to do with the intergenerational character of our traditions. All of us were born into a world that was already here when we arrived. We didn't create it. We didn't choose where and when to enter it. And yet, we're bound by the inherited rules and orders of the place we entered. They define the portion of our humanity that's given shape to us. And so they're ours, and we are theirs. We could reject those inheritances, but that would mean rejecting who we are, which can't be done lightly. There have always been people in liberal societies who have argued that imposed rules and ways of life that are rooted in the choices of prior generations are illegitimate, and that every generation should be free to establish its own frameworks for its common life from scratch. Even Thomas Jefferson thought that at one point after he had spent a little bit too long in France. But insisting that only our own choices can legitimate our way of life is ultimately not only impractical, but totally unreasonable. It's a view that accepts a much too abstract or rationalistic conception of what a tradition is. It says that to embrace a tradition is to accept what other people in the past have believed because the past has the authority to force us to do it. But the question of tradition is exactly not a question about other people. It is not about believing what other people believed. It's about living as our people have lived. It's about the reality that we are, in fact, links in a chain. And yet, that doesn't mean that we can blindly embrace inherited ways and assume their legitimacy and truth. That is not quite the right relation to the past either. We have to somehow find a balance between reverence and gratitude on the one hand, and independence and judgment on the other. A balance between radical individual liberation and utter submission to tradition. And how can we find that balance? This is, of course, just another way of putting the very question that we're turning over and over together tonight, the question of the semi-quincentennial. We happen to be here playing our part in the long chain of generations that's composed the American nation at the moment that our nation is turning 250 years old. So how should we mark that occasion in light of the difficult balance we're looking to strike? How should we regard the tradition we're called on to commemorate and continue? What's the right attitude, the right balance of attitudes to have toward the American founding? To put the question that way is to see how the analogy to the generational character of family life can help us to answer it. We can approach the challenge of how we ought to consider the prior generations of our own society by analogy to the ways that we relate to the sources of our being, an analogy to the different ways in which children consider and approach their parents. And I would say very roughly, we might think of three ways that kids approach their parents. There is first a childish way. Young children often think their parents are perfect. They hung the moon, they have all the answers. Something goes wrong, you go to mom, she fixes it because she knows everything and can do anything. That is a childish way to regard your parents, and there are some examples of thinking of our nation's founders in this way, as bronze statues on horseback, paintings of George Washington praying in the woods with a bird on his shoulder, all the way down. Unblemished, unerring, perfect people who have all the answers. This kind of patriotism, I should say, is fine to begin with. It's fine for the very young. But it only goes so far, and it easily bleeds into a kind of childish idolatry. But the childish approach to your parents is not the only one. Over time, as you get a little older and enter your teenage years, you come to recognize that maybe your parents are very far from perfect. Maybe one of them has a short temper, and the other has a terrible sense of direction. Maybe they lied to you about the tooth fairy. So what else are they lying to you about? Maybe they're lying to you about everything. This is the second way in which children sometimes approach their parents, the juvenile way. It's a function of disillusionment, of having thought you were supposed to believe your parents were perfect and then realizing they weren't, and coming to think of them as fully defined by their worst vices and sins, so that whatever they are is what you don't want to be. There are examples of this juvenile way of thinking about our political tradition and the country's founders all around us now. The notion that the founders were just grubby, rich white men making excuses for themselves, that slavery was all they cared about, that their eloquent words were just cover for naked interest, or worse. They weren't just imperfect, they were perfectly awful. This is, I would say, the dominant way of understanding our political tradition in America's intellectual class and in many of our academic institutions. It is puerile and foolish, and it easily bleeds into a kind of juvenile iconoclasm. It sometimes seems like the childish and juvenile ways of thinking about our political tradition are the only options that we have. But there is another way to think about your parents, neither childish nor juvenile, that can offer us another model. When you get a little older, especially when you have children of your own, you gradually arrive at a different kind of relation to your parents. Maybe one day you find yourself sitting across from a toddler telling her not to eat pasta with her hands, or you hear yourself telling your 8-year-old to be careful, and you kind of hear your father's voice coming out of your own head. You find yourself thinking, I am my parents. I am my parents. I'm doing what they were doing. And in some respects, I'm not nearly as good at it as they were, and I need to learn from them. In other ways, I can see things that they did wrong or that I would do differently. But in both respects, I approach their example with reverence, because I understand what they were trying to achieve. I understand that they were limited human beings, just like I am, and I can see that what they did, for all their flaws, was in fact pretty admirable, and that it made my own life possible. I can almost relate to them from the inside. This is a mature relation to your parents, neither childish nor juvenile, neither idolatrous nor iconoclastic. It's the kind of relationship that we should strive to have with the traditions we are part of, including our national political tradition. In any tradition, recognizing that I'm doing what prior generations were doing means that I can come to see that what this tradition consists of are models of people who can offer me profoundly valuable guidance on how to take on some of the most difficult challenges I'm going to face. It's both positive and negative guidance, more positive than negative in a healthy tradition, but it is both. The tradition is certainly not right about everything, but it is right about more than I would be without it. And it allows me to learn from the trial and error of others, to discern wisdom that I would not have arrived at on my own, to see paths to truth that run deeper than I could have reached. It's a tremendously valuable source of understanding and experience that I ought to venerate even when it shows me what not to do. This is a mature relation to a tradition we are part of. The founders of our nation, the framers of our Constitution, too, were trying to do something that we are also trying to do, to enable a vast, diverse, complicated society full of dynamic, bold, slightly crazy people to live together and address common problems while respecting each other and taking the truth about the human person seriously. In some respects, they did it a lot better than we could. George Washington was a better natural leader, I'm willing to bet, than anybody in this room. James Madison was a lot smarter about institutional design than you and I are likely to be. We should preserve and reinforce what they established. In other respects, we can see that they failed to live up to their own standards in ways that we hope we would not. Both Washington and Madison held other human beings in bondage as slaves. We should never excuse that. We should learn from it about the human tendency to turn a blind eye to brazen injustice, a tendency to which we are very far from immune in our own time. We can do both of these things at once because we understand that Washington and Madison were not superhuman heroes or subhuman villains. They were doing what we are doing and have left us frameworks and lessons of incalculable value to help us do it better. Neither idolatry nor iconoclasm is the right way to approach them. We should rather seek grateful, clear-eyed reverence, rooted in the knowledge that we did not earn the extraordinary gift that they bequeathed to us, and in the confidence that we could earn it now by passing it down in an improved form to our children. That is what it would mean to understand ourselves as living within the same tradition they did, to say us and our country when we talk about them. We are a single people over time. We are still the ones who did it. And what we do or seek to do is more or less the same in every generation, which is why we learn from prior generations of practitioners of our own tradition. In every generation, too, there are some escapists who want to run away from the obligations that our tradition imposes on us by insisting that this time is different, that this generation faces completely new and much harder challenges than ever, and so the old ways have nothing to offer us. The world has changed and has rendered our inheritance useless, or worse. In our time, some of these Jacobins even call themselves radical traditionalists, but they are the furthest thing from traditionalists. They deny the fundamental premise of traditionalism, that the core human challenges are the same in every generation. And what makes this time distinct is not that the basic work to be done is different, but that it is our turn to do it. There is no excuse for avoiding it. We can do that work by beginning from what prior generations have given us with gratitude and reasoning from there, so that we ultimately end up choosing to embrace our inheritance, partly because it is ours, but mostly because it is good. That mix of celebration and reflection, of gratitude and judgment, is what an occasion like America's 250th calls for. It is a birthday, yes, and it is an anniversary. It's a civic commemoration, and so an occasion for both gratitude and reflection, both of which point us toward a recommitment. In this sense, we can turn back to Lincoln one last time and agree wholeheartedly with the fundamental message of the Gettysburg Address. We are recommitting ourselves to a national cause that we did not choose, but which we now see that we would and should choose. We're choosing our inheritance and the burdens and blessings that come with it. We do it not because prior generations offer us a model of perfection. They don't. We do it because they offer us a model of contending with imperfection and of striving toward the good and the true. That is most truly what it means to celebrate this semi-quincentennial. We affirm the rightness of the original choice made by prior generations by making that same choice ourselves. Our particular tradition makes that a little easier to see by articulating the terms of that choice unusually clearly for us in the Declaration of Independence. We choose to live in light of the truth that we are all created equal and of the implications of that truth. We haven't always lived up to that standard, but it has always been there when we've failed to hold us to account, and it still is. We are a nation that has lived its life in light of that truth, and that in moments of great national celebration feels compelled somehow to recur to that truth, to repeat it, to restate it, to recommit to it, and in that peculiar way to celebrate itself. That's the kind of celebration that we should strive for in the coming year. Call it a birthday, call it an anniversary, call it what you want, but whatever you call it, treat it as an opportunity for mature, reverent reflection and judgment about the political tradition that we're privileged to be part of and the nation that we're privileged to belong to. An opportunity for gratitude and therefore also for hope. Happy 250th. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Yuval. We've got plenty of time for Q&A. There are a couple of mics that will come around. Please wait for one to reach you before asking your question. Do we have any hands in the back? Yes, a student first. Excellent. Yeah, wait on the mic.
Well, thank you so much for coming, and thank you for celebrating this very important anniversary that I think not a lot of people are celebrating or thinking about, so it's exciting to begin that process. You hinted at the beginning of your remarks, but there seems to be a false dichotomy to me being presented between America as an idea and America as a nation, that especially on the right, there are a lot of these sort of linguistic battles happening over this, and different sides are advancing their conception of America. The way I've always tended to think about it, and I think Rabbi Sachs has talked about this as well, is nations as stories, and America in particular as a nation that values language, that values telling its story. I love Hamilton. I just saw it a few months ago for its 10th anniversary, and it seems to be one of those kinds of very American things that we do. So can you talk at all if that's an accurate depiction of America, if it's a politically salient category to call us some sort of story that we can tell?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, and especially for pointing to Rabbi Sachs, because I think the answer that he offers us to that question is that a nation is a story and a nation is a home. And I think that is a way of containing both sides of that dichotomy you point to, which, as you say, I think we've forced ourselves into kind of a silly argument on the right about whether America is best understood as a set of ideas or best understood as a people. And I think the answer is yes. America is best understood as a people that has always been organized around a set of ideas. And the way to see that, I do think, is through our national story, through those moments of great challenge and great triumph, in all of which we have found reasons to recur to the core ideas that we believe in. In the most difficult times our country's faced, in the Civil War, in the Second World War, what you find are national leaders who call Americans to their best selves by calling them to the ideas that have held us together. And that's not a way to deny that we are a nation of human beings, that our story is what we have lived together, and that we have a national story in common. I think Lincoln in particular understands that these are two sides of the same coin, and that when you talk about American ideas, you're not just calling on philosophy, you're calling on memory. And you can see in the closing of his second inaugural, the appeal to the mystic chords of memory is not mystic in the sense that it is irrational. It's mystic in the sense that it runs as deep as it is possible to run. And that's only possible because those ideas do run all the way to the core of our national being. So I'm with you. When I hear that debate about whether we should understand our country based on the ideals of the American founding or the history we've lived together, I say yes, that's right.
Yes, David.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. Can I ask a follow-up to this question? So in the beginning of your talk, you compared America to many nations in Europe or elsewhere that have not existed so long under the same political regime, right? In that sense, I think for France or Portugal or others, you can make a meaningful distinction between the nation and the regime. But as this question pointed out, and as you said yes to both,
right,
it is a much more difficult distinction to draw in the American case.
Yes.
So at the occasion of this momentous anniversary, which is also an occasion to reflect on the future and where we're headed, I'm wondering what your thoughts are as the ideas of the founding, it seems to me, increasingly come under attack, not just from without, which they've always been, but increasingly from within and with increasingly stronger currency. What does it mean to say that America is a nation in distinction from its political regime?
Mm-hmm.
Or some version of this question I have a hard time articulating.
Yeah, no, I think you have articulated it. There is a way in which the United States stands out for having its core national identity deeply tied to its political character, to the structure of its institutions, to its political commitments, maybe we would say to its regime in a classical sense. And I think that part of what that means is that the kind of loose talk about breaking the regime that might be a little more tolerable in European societies, I think there's still a problem, but a little more tolerable, is actually a much more fundamental attack on the core character of our society when it is applied in the United States. Because it is an argument against our national character and not just against a political philosophy. The American story has taken shape in light of American ideas, and that's been true from the beginning. And I don't think you can separate our national character from our national history from those ideals in the way that maybe it's possible to do in other nations. And so I think the notion that there can just be an American nation and that the way in which it thinks about politics doesn't have to be connected to the particular truths that are declared at the outset, I don't think that's right. I think that the attack on that character is an attack on those truths, a rejection of them. And since those truths are true, I think that rejection is ultimately rooted in falsehood and dangerous for our society. So that I think here, the case for the free society, the case for the kind of liberal democratic republic rooted in the ideal of human equality that we have, is not just one way that the American nation might live. It is part of what the American nation is. And to reject it is to reject who we are and to suggest that we don't have a right to be here as we are. I think it's why those debates matter more here. But I would say one final thing. I do think the ideas of the American Declaration of Independence are very widely accepted by the American public. There are certainly debates among intellectuals, there always have been, about whether these things are true or not. But the American people, left and right, and I know I don't suggest by saying this that everybody agrees with my politics, but I think the American people really do believe in equality. We really do. We argue about what it is, what it means in this case and that case, but we're arguing about it from within the tradition, generally speaking. Actual rejections of the Declaration's ideals still are pretty rare, even now.
Yes, Dimitri.
Thanks so much for the wonderful talk. I suppose the specific event that we are celebrating is a declaration of war. And I guess today's Veterans Day, so there's some, it's a fortuitous link. And in the famous, those famous lines in Gettysburg about how we cannot consecrate, we cannot dedicate this land. That has been done by the men who fought and died in the battle. And so there is this martial, sacrificial political theology in some way underlying both traditional American celebrations of the 4th of July and then the vision laid out at the Gettysburg Address. So I'm just wondering, how do you think we should think about that dimension of the 250th?
Yeah, I think it is very important, but I would say it's important to see the order of arguments that Lincoln makes, right? The sacrifice that those men made at Gettysburg is ultimately a sacrifice on behalf of the ideals to which that nation was dedicated, as he understands it. So that it's not simply a celebration of martial success. It's not simply a celebration of military virtue. It's a celebration of a willingness to sacrifice for the truth and for the nation. So the recognition, the gratitude for the people who made the greatest of all possible sacrifices is essential to any nation. But I do think that there's something distinct about the way in which we think about what they're sacrificing for in our nation. And it matters, so that it isn't simply about the strength of our arms, and it isn't simply about the fact that we fought for this and we're united by the struggles we've been through. There is also that element in it that says that this begins from a kind of commitment to the truth. I don't think we should minimize it. I don't think we should treat it as though it just happens to be there. It's not everything, as I've been saying. It's not everything. It's not the only reason why there is an American patriotism. But I don't think there's an American patriotism without it.
Yes, Robbie.
Yuval, it's wonderful to have you back with us here in the Madison program. I was intrigued by what you had to say about Lincoln's reference to the nation being dedicated to a proposition, to the proposition that all men are created equal. And Lincoln could scarcely have a non-biblical thought. So that gets me thinking, when I heard you say what you said, gosh, there is dedication in the Bible. Jewish children, I can only think of male examples, but I don't know, perhaps there were female examples as well in the Bible. But Jewish children, Samson, Samuel, Jesus, are sometimes dedicated. Now, I don't know enough about Jewish antiquity to know exactly what that means, but I was only indirectly a student of the great Leon Cash. You were his star student. So I suspect you do know something about what that concept is biblically and how that might have been somewhere in, if not explicit, at least somewhere implicit in Lincoln's thinking when he chooses a term like that.
That's a wonderful question, Robbie. I don't have an answer to it, so let me dance around it to distract you from my not having an answer to it. I do think that there is a way in which there are a few occasions in the Hebrew Bible where the birth of a child is seen as an occasion for dedication to God and to the covenant, in a sense, to the commitment between God and the people. And what becomes of those children is something special in the world. And they play some vital part in the way in which that relationship comes to be strengthened and built up. I would have to think about what Lincoln might have been analogizing there, what he was thinking through. It is striking that he uses conceived and brought forth. He wants to make us think about birth, about children, so that there is something in this new nation that is a dedicated child. But I'll have to think about that and maybe call Leon and see what he thinks about it, because he certainly has.
Let me see if this triggers an idea. If you're a dedicated child, let's say Samson, Samuel, Jesus, if you're dedicated, does that just mean you stand for something or that something will happen to you? Or could it mean that you have something of a mission or a vocation or a calling? And if so, is Lincoln suggesting that the nation has a mission? He refers to our nation, the American people, at one point as an almost chosen people.
Yeah.
And the people who are the chosen people, the real ones, are chosen for a mission, to be a light unto the Gentiles.
It's wonderful. I think that's right, and those examples certainly suggest they're different examples. Samson and Samuel are very different, but yeah, I mean, I do think in both cases there's a way that in creating that in giving them birth, they were seen as having a purpose in the world that was distinct from everyone else. I think there's something to work with there, Robbie. I haven't seen it done, and I'm going to have to try to do it.
Well, there's your next book, and you're welcome.
Well,
Yes, we have a question over here.
You didn't actually mention a very important part of birthdays, which of course is present giving. So what should the rest of the world be giving America as a present?
yeah, that's right. That's a wonderful question. I think that, I have reached the point in life, having teenage children, that what I ask for my birthday is a little peace and quiet, and we could use that from other nations. But I think that in thinking about the gift side of birthdays, we ought to also think about what we could give our country, about what we might have to offer as a show of gratitude and appreciation. I would hope that other nations would too. I'm not sure they're in the mood just now, but we'll have to see.
Yes, right here on the aisle.
The poster for this speech, this talk, said, "What do we? How should we celebrate?" But your talk was more, what are we celebrating?
Yeah.
I'm curious whether you've given any thought to how we should celebrate as
Yeah.
a nation this event, besides fireworks.
Yeah. So look, given that this is how I think we should celebrate, that is by working toward a mature relationship to our political tradition, a relationship of gratitude rooted in a deep understanding that teaches us something. The way I think we should celebrate it is, first of all, by getting together to talk about our country and think about our country. I would also tell you about a project that I've been involved with at the American Enterprise Institute, where I work, that Robbie's also been involved with, where we have brought together groups of scholars to think about different themes related to the American founding, and do some new writing, some new thinking directed to students, that offers some ways of thinking about contemporary challenges and about timeless challenges through the lens of the American founding and the American Revolution. I think that kind of work, using the founding as a means of advancing our self-understanding and our appreciation of our society, is how we ought to celebrate our country. There should also be fireworks, and there should be, tall ships. That'll be great. But if there's an enduring contribution to the civic education of the next generation, then we will really have celebrated in the right way. And I think there can be.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Professor Levin, for your lecture. It was mentioned the idea of birthday and giving presents for birthday. But my question concerns the future of something we can call American leadership and the global appeal of the American model, American vision of the state, of the nation, and of the freedom. And I'm from Eastern Europe, and for countries like Poland, the American vision, the American model, was always a guiding light for decades. And today, however, on the USA's anniversary, I would say that it's no more, because America is struggling her own problems, and this narrative, this vision is losing its power. So my question is, what new, credible story can the United States offer to the world today? I mean, what is the American vision of the nation and freedom for the next 100 years? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that the vision we have to offer is the vision we have always had to offer. And the question of whether we will do it in a way that is seen as appealing and as holding up a high standard by the rest of the world is a question of whether we are living up to that standard ourselves and whether we in fact are advancing that story, advancing that idea. That's a real question now, surely, but it's been a real question before. It's never been an easy matter for the United States. I do think the world should look to the American example still as a model of how a nation can thrive in the modern world, enabling itself to flourish both materially and morally by dedicating itself to a set of commitments that begin in the truth of equal human dignity. And that is still true of our society. We're not as good at talking about it in this moment, and we're not as good at living it out in our politics as we ought to be. So that's always a challenge for us. But it's, to me, not a matter of a new model or a new story, but of whether we're really going to be up to recommitting ourselves to the foundations of our traditions and holding those up as still true as they are. So the challenges are a challenge, but I do think that what we have to offer is what we've always had to offer. And the question we face is the question every generation has faced, the question of whether we're up to it and whether we can pass it along to our children in the way that our fathers did to us. I'm not sure. They weren't sure either. And it's up to us. So we have to prove it.
Yes, a question in the front here, in the front row.
Thank you for that wonderful talk and your diligence in seeking the right blend of postures and attitudes towards our founding. If that were a common expression of patriotism, I think the world would be very different. I'd like to return to the metaphor of intergenerational relationships. I wonder if we should search for a metaphor that can articulate more of a presumptive asymmetry. So, for example, let's say my mom got us out of poverty and worked 4 jobs, and I came out healthy and stable. So I'm parenting now. I make some mistakes that she made. I make some good decisions that she made. But perhaps I have a presumption in her favor because I'm not facing the kinds of challenges that she faced. Is there a further metaphor we could find that would express that reverence and respect while maintaining enough judgment to stand back and select?
Thank you. It's a wonderful question. I think that that's a question that, in a way, we always have to wrestle with when we think about our relation to the past in that way. The present is not the past, and our situation is not exactly what theirs was. Whether by theirs we mean Americans of the late 18th century or our parents or grandparents or great-grandparents. But I think that the reason why there are some enduring connections and realities and analogies is that at the core of the challenges we face are not the limits of our practical circumstances or the ways the world has changed. At the core is human nature, and human nature has not changed. And in that sense, the challenge is still the challenge. The temptations are still the temptations. The tendency toward vice and sin is still the same. The potential for great heights of human excellence is still the same. And the core equality of dignity is still the same. I think those things matter most. So that it seems to me, and this is just the way in which I'm a conservative, I guess. It seems to me that where it matters most, the past and the present just aren't that different. And the future probably won't be that different either. That's why we can learn from the great wisdom of the wisest thinkers of the past. It's why we can hope to have something to offer the future, too. Because ultimately, the deepest challenges are the challenges that are rooted in the human heart. And to say that we are all created equal means that we bear the same relation to the Creator as everybody in all times and places. And I just don't think we ever get away from that. And it always seems to me that when we're told we've gotten away from it, when we're told it doesn't matter anymore, we don't need these things because those were for an older time, these kinds of limits were for other people, that way lies ruin every time. And it does seem to me, therefore, that even when it's not perfectly obvious to us, that's a reason to take seriously the ways in which our tradition offers us a path to flourishing. And that's going to remain true, I think.
Yes, a question just behind Christy there.
Thank you for the talk. Your talk was a call to us to love our traditions, right? And our legacies as received to us as our history and our memory. We are connected thus remotely to the distinctions of the founders. It does call to mind, in my view, the question of American exceptionalism. And it puts me in mind as a Princetonian living here locally and of the university to think about even our own motto, Princeton in the nation's service, which has been more recently amended to be Princeton in the service of humanity, let's say. Upon what, in your call to us to love our traditions and so on, what is the premise upon which you're basing this? I'm thinking about the state of our civic education and the national consensus that we have, and frankly, what I see to be the hostility to the concept of American exceptionalism, even amongst the members of the highest positions in our government, including a previous president who really himself called into question the idea of American exceptionalism. So what are we to conclude here? What is the premises? What do we need to do or should we do to in regards to our civic education, and should we indeed revitalize the concept of American exceptionalism, or even in this campus, the idea of American in the nation's service being in the service to the ideals that this very program is founded upon to serve?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think it's really possible to act in the nation, in the service of the world if you don't first act in the service of the nation. I don't think it's possible to act in the service of the nation if you don't first act in the service of your community. I don't think it's possible to act in the service of your community if you don't first act in the service of your family. That's just a fact about how good is done, it seems to me. And so we have to begin from what is ours. We can't end with what is ours. And I do think in that sense that Lincoln is right to say that a great man loves his country both because it is his and especially because it is good. It's worth our while to investigate whether what is ours is also good. And I think that we are fortunate to live in a society where that is true. It's not the only society where that is true, but we do live in a society where what is ours is also good and points to the true in ways that are absolutely distinct. It would be crazy to think that America is not exceptional. I don't think you can compare it to anything else in the history of the world in a way that could lead you to that conclusion. Now, the particular ways in which it seems to me that we should understand and define our connection to our national tradition are rooted in a set of ideas that I take to be a path to the truth. It seems to me that the United States offers that to its people in some uniquely effective ways. It actually began by stating those truths. That's not true of everybody. And all of that amounts to a set of tools for us to use to help the rising generation understand why it should feel grateful and privileged to be rising in this particular society. I think it is on us to convey that sense, and I think we're doing a poor job of it, broadly speaking. There is something of an awakening of civics education in this moment in America. I'm not sure where it'll go. It's very unclear, but there is more of an interest in it than there was a generation ago, and we need to work with that and try to step into that space and make the most of it. It seems to me there's a real opportunity there, and so we shouldn't waste it, but I certainly wouldn't downplay the kinds of risks and threats that you point to. I think those are very real, and I agree with you about the character.
Yes, Mike Hawley.
Thanks. I really enjoyed the talk. I want to ask about this truth of equal human dignity that you're talking about, and in particular, how you would relate it to what seems to be another still minority but rising view of how we ought to relate to the founders, which is not to reject them because they were racist slave owners, but to reject the self-evidence claim of equal human dignity. There seems to be a rising minority view that maybe that isn't quite so self-evident. I'm wondering how you think we ought to vindicate that claim, and whether you think vindicating that claim requires appeals to, say, revealed religion, Judeo-Christianity, or if there's a way to make that appeal to people who don't share those commitments.
You know, I mean, to ask me to answer that question with Robbie sitting right there seems like a misdirection on your part. I think that Jefferson is closer to the truth than Lincoln when he says that this truth is self-evident. Lincoln calls it a proposition. It can work both ways. If you treat it as a proposition, I do think that you can demonstrate it. And Robbie's shown us how in a variety of ways. I do think the most straightforward way is in the way that Jefferson's language suggests, which is that we are equal because we have an equal relation to a creator. The verb in that sentence is created, and that's not a coincidence. I don't think that's the only way to demonstrate the truth of a fundamental human equality. And it also seems to me that if the premise of the political philosophy and ideology of someone in our contemporary politics is that equality is untrue, that person really isn't going to get all that far. You can get far on the internet, but I don't think you get all that far in American life. And so it does seem to me that the commitment to some fundamental human equality still matters quite a bit to many Americans. It is mostly, I think, for reasons that are rooted in religion. We are still a religious society, not as religious as we used to be, but more religious than most. And in some very fundamental ways, we hold to commitments that are rooted in Jewish and Christian ideas, even if we don't admit it to ourselves. But those aren't the only path. And it does seem to me that the case for the truth of the proposition is very strong. Whether it's self-evident may be another matter, but that does seem to matter less than whether it's true, and it is.
Yes, MJ, and then Connor.
Do you think there's a difficulty with analogizing the family and the political community insofar as our political culture is very government by the consent of the governed, and when you apply that to the family, you tend to sort of undercut the family. I think you're probably very familiar with the various liberal and proto-liberal thinkers and their approaches to the family, which would suggest this. Yeah. So, do you think there's any difficulty?
Yeah, I certainly tried to gesture towards some of these worries. There was more of that originally, and I took it out this afternoon because there was an awful lot of it. But the value of that analogy is not to suggest that politics is like family life, but that we should think about society as an intergenerational connection. And so it's about the generational character of family more than the way in which we relate to family in the present. I do think that some of the unchosen character of family life is also true of civic life, and that we overstate the chosenness of our civic life because we incline to a vocabulary of politics that is rooted in the centrality of choice to a degree that's just greater than what is supportable by reality. Our liberal vocabulary isn't quite true as a way of describing our actual existence in society. And in this sense, the idea of liberal society that I would identify with the tradition that, for instance, Edmund Burke represents, rather than the tradition that John Locke does, seems more true to me. Those are not opposing traditions exactly. And I choose those two because they're both Whigs in the English tradition. But they do disagree about this question of whether ultimately it is only choice that can confer legitimacy. I think there absolutely are unchosen commitments that are legitimate and obligatory. And it seems to me it would be crazy to build a society in which that were not the case. It's kind of unimaginable. We don't have a great vocabulary for it. And I do think that our political vocabulary, our political theory in America has always been thinner and shallower than our political reality. And when we behave as though those theories are all there is, our society comes to seem much less defensible than it really is. So we certainly need better political theory, which I guess is what a political theorist would say. But I do think that the analogy is valuable only in as much as it describes the intergenerational character of society, which I think is very important to see. To reject that, which people have done, as I suggested. Jefferson did that, Tom Paine did that. There were a lot of radical Whigs doing it in England around the time of the French Revolution. I do think that is a pretty profound mistake.
Yes, Connor.
Thanks, Yuval. This was really, really fruitful and productive. I like the distinction in the three different ways. I'm generally persuaded in the value and how compelling a posture of. I'm generally persuaded by how kind of compelling or valuable that posture of reverence would be. Sounds like others are as well. So I'm going to push back a little bit and ask this from a position of support, but also maybe to play some devil's advocate, trying to think through what would someone who disagrees say about this. So it's on two dimensions. The first is how historically contingent is this posture. It seems to me in 2025, it's maybe not easy, but understandable why we could have admiration and reverence. Maybe not in 1950, maybe not in 1910, in 1850, right? So is this merely a factor of where we are in the particular tradition that we've had, that we can value it precisely because of how it's developed and changed? And that connects to the second dimension of the question, which is there might be an irony here in, do you see this posture that you're encouraging as a posture that was shared by the founders themselves? So I think of that, what kind of characterized them, and in some ways what characterizes your own work, is a really subtle and sophisticated balancing of both gratitude, but also embracing reform and even revolution, right? So the founders themselves, I don't know if I'd describe their posture towards their inheritance as reverence. Can you both embrace revolution and reverence? So how do you puzzle through either the tension between or how to reconcile both of those?
Yeah, thank you. A wonderful question. Let me speak to the second part first. I think that the bulk of the Declaration of Independence is devoted to describing the way in which a once legitimate mode of government has been deformed in ways that make it necessary to reclaim its legitimacy by building anew. I don't think that it is revolutionary in the sense that the Jacobins were. That it's not a rejection of the tradition that that American and Anglo-American life had been built on. And when you read the grievances in the Declaration, the gist of them is very strange for a revolutionary document, right? Because they argue about the ways in which the king had lately changed his mode of ruling to make it no longer capable of securing the people's rights. There's a point where they say he altered and abolished our basic charters and liberties. It's a very strange argument for revolution, right? Because it is an argument for reclamation. And in that sense, I do think that the founders were, on the whole, tradition-minded and reverential toward the tradition of English common law and of English political life. Obviously, they weren't simply so, and they were revolutionaries. They were founders of something new. The approach to them as founders, the language of founders, mostly comes after them. There are ways in which James Madison starts to use that language. Michael Zuckert actually has a wonderful essay on this subject. I think it's worth our seeing how different their vocabulary was from, say, the French revolutionaries. In roughly the same era, trying to do something that was obviously related to what the Americans did, but that took a very, very different approach to the traditions of their own society. And so I think there is something in them that did try to approach the past in this more reverential way, but of course they were revolutionaries, and I wouldn't downplay that. I've talked myself out of remembering your first question, so maybe yeah, I'm not sure I understand that. So why wouldn't you be able to have that kind of attitude in 1950 or 1910?
I think it depends who you are. I think that
sure. Well, that's true now too.
True. But even, I don't want to get into comparing that. But the pre-civil rights revolution, 1910 is the decade with the most lynchings in American history.
No, but look, I think on this front, Martin Luther King offers us the right way to think about this. The tradition is the answer to that problem. It's not the problem. The words of the Declaration have been sitting there, tapping their fingers, watching us unapprovingly the whole time. And in some way or another, in every generation, there's been some way in which America has said, yeah, but not those people. And the Declaration just says all. And that was true in 1950 and in 1910. We have not done by any means a perfect job of living up to the incredibly demanding set of constraints that the Declaration puts on what we can do to one another. But it has been there making those demands the whole time. And I do think that in that sense, it's played this part for us and still does.
Yes, a question down here. Just a moment, she's bringing the microphone.
In view of all you've been talking about, how do you view the current political situation and our distinguished president who is trying perhaps to change a few things in our polity?
A focused question and an easy one. I think that the tradition I'm pointing to here has always had a lot to teach our politicians, and that is at least as true now as it has ever been. I don't think that our commitment to these ideals is in great order in this moment. And I also think that our president is not particularly aware of these demands and of this tradition and of what's required of him if we're going to sustain it. So I'm worried. We've been through worse, but that doesn't mean that we're not going through real trouble. I think we are. How's that?
David.
I want to ask a follow-up to MJ's question, which is to raise a sort of Tocquevillian obstacle to your argument, namely that you've highlighted above all from the Declaration of Independence the commitment to equality. And as Tocqueville so well diagnoses, that commitment to equality makes Americans especially disinclined to heed authority or tradition. Now, I'm very much on board for your pitch as to what we should do and what would be good for us to do. But I wonder if we're not where we are now precisely because that commitment to equality has tap, 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 like the Declaration worked its evils or, its whatever consequences over time. And so, in such a society with such a commitment to equality, how successful can it be to say and preach something that, even the word reverence would grate many an American Democrat? Understood. That's the
Yeah, I mean, in a funny way, what gives me some hope in the face of that very, very real worry is that it was Tocqueville's worry in 1830. He was right to worry about it then. He had a sense of what Americans might do about it then, and that sense still applies now. He would be right to worry about it now. And I think the ways in which we might redress that, which is by leavening our egalitarianism with republicanism, with a sense of responsibility, all of which I think are ultimately demanded by the ideals of the Declaration properly understood. I do think that that our tradition offers us a lot of resources for addressing the Tocquevillian problem. I absolutely think it is a very real problem, and that there are ways in which equality can act as an acid that melts away all human connections and obligations. But there are also counterforces to that in religion and in American civil society, in our commitments to one another, and those are renewable in every generation, so that we should not think of their fate as a sustained downhill slide. That's not a good description of American history. Whether they will be renewed in this generation is like the question of whether the American order itself will be, up to us. And so the question is, what are we going to do about it? And I don't just mean as political theorists. I mean as parents, as neighbors, as members of communities, as people with real power to make a real difference in the lives of other real people. That's always the challenge. And the answer to that is not just to say equality over and over, right? That's not enough. And it's not just to say liberty over and over either. It requires us to understand ourselves as having a role to play in the lives of other people that has to be formative of virtuous character. And there are a lot of people who depend on us in that way, all of us, each of us, and we've got to take that obligation seriously. And so, I often think about what the founding generation might have meant when they talked about civic virtue, right? And they weren't just talking about virtues, about specific habits and ways of acting that might be good and useful, but about virtue. And I have come to think that what virtue in that singular sense really means is the strength to play your part. Different people have different parts to play, but whether they are virtuous people is about whether they have the strength to play those parts. As a father or a mother, as a teacher, as a student, as a leader of a community, as a member of a congregation. Those are all parts that come with real privileges, but also with heavy obligations, serious responsibilities. And we can't use equality and liberty as excuses to shirk those. There are no excuses. And so it seems to me that the question is not just whether we'll remain committed to equality and liberty, but also whether we will have that virtue. What can you say except I hope so? And as an individual, we should try.
Robbie.
Yuval, since we only have a few more minutes, maybe we could close with some reflection on the situation in the contemporary conservative movement and how conservatives should be looking to 2026. Patrick Deneen became famous, his book became famous, Why Liberalism Failed, when it was promoted by Barack Obama, which is interesting if you know anything about Patrick and his book. Patrick, of course, was our former colleague here at Princeton, now professor at Notre Dame, who essentially argues that the seeds of 1968 were planted in 1776. So why are we celebrating the American founding when what it led to was basically modern progressivism as it manifests itself, for example, in the most extreme forms of woke ideology. Okay, the American civic order is obviously different from European civic orders. And American liberalism is different, unsurprisingly, from European liberalism is different from American liberalism. But American conservatism is also different from European conservatism. There may be a kind of distant cousin relationship there, but it really is quite different. European conservatism being blood and soil conservatism or throne and altar conservatism, precisely the kind of view that would be utterly baffled by what you quoted Lincoln as saying about blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh. And yet here we are in 2025, where American conservatism seems to be facing a genuine identity crisis, which basically, in my view, and you'll let you speak for yourself on this, which basically reflects a kind of loss of faith by some in American exceptionalism. In other words, in a kind of conservatism that is not at the end of the day reducible to blood and soil and throne and altar. So I don't see any way that American conservatives can celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration without coming to terms with that identity issue. And I think I would say this week something I might not have said last week. It's not clear to me today who's going to win that struggle. How does it look to you?
Yeah, look, I agree with that framing of the question, and I guess I'd say I think it's never entirely clear who's going to win that struggle. I think there are very serious reasons to worry about how it's going, and that a major reason for that is that the case for American conservatism, as I understand it, which works to conserve the promise of the American Revolution, the promise of the American nation, the commitment to the durable truths I've tried to highlight here too. The case for that conservatism is not being made as energetically as it ought to be to the rising generation and to the larger society. And that the case for a much more European kind of conservatism is now being made with an unusual energy, at least unusual for America. I think the most ironic thing about this new kind of right in America is that it first arose to present itself under the banner of a kind of nationalism. There's really nothing, I think, less American than this in our politics right now. I do think that it is a weird kind of import, and that it's in that sense not exactly conservationist, because it isn't trying to conserve the American political tradition. It's trying to overturn it or overcome it or replace it. There's room for that kind of argument in any politics, but I don't think it's conservatism, and I also, as you might imagine, don't think that it's right. It seems to me that some of the arguments made on its behalf have now gone further than their advocates imagined and wanted. I had this argument with him for a long time, but I do think that he is an American patriot, and I would imagine that he is worried about what now worries you and me too. It's worth asking him, but it does seem to me that fight about what is the right for, and in what sense are we trying to conserve something, and what would that be, and why, is a fight that has to be had in a way that needs to be made inviting to younger Americans. And the case for the American political tradition has to be made anew in every generation. That's why using the occasion of the 250th as an opportunity to remake that case is how I at least have thought of the opportunity it offers, and I know you have too.
Yeah, that certainly strikes me as correct, Yuval. I'm struck that you find so many people now in the conservative movement who seem to be articulating as if it were something new, a kind of rejection of American exceptionalism, a rejection of American ideals and institutions, of the sort that you found in the progressive movement when my predecessor was the first McCormick professor of jurisprudence, the guy in my chair, Woodrow Wilson, was teaching here. And he made clear that he rejected the American system, the regime as in its Madisonian, in any event, in its Madisonian manifestations. It's almost as if the horseshoe has completed itself, and the left and the right are meeting, and then there are just a dwindling number of people who are defending what Lincoln called the ancient faith.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly a Wilsonian element to what has come to call itself the New Right in a lot of ways, and a Wilsonian element to this moment in our politics in general. And that's part of why, for me, the case that needs to be made in this moment is not just Lincoln's case, but Madison's too. There is more to do than make a case, but for those of us in the case-making business, we have to at least do that.
Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time. Please join me in thanking you all for a great lecture.